Imagine living in a world where taking your own life wouldn't just end your existence, it would condemn your soul to eternal torture, your body to public desecration, and your family to generations of shame and poverty. This wasn't a fictional nightmare, but the harsh reality of medieval Europe, where the Catholic Church's iron grip on society extended far beyond the grave. In this world of absolute religious authority, a chilling pattern emerged, one that would expose the darkest corners of human desperation and religious terror. Between 1580 and 1839, hundreds of people found themselves trapped in an impossible choice between unbearable earthly suffering and eternal damnation. Their solution would become one of history's most macabre loopholes, a calculated dance with death that turned murder into a twisted path to salvation. The Church's doctrine on suicide, fortified by St. Augustine's teachings, created an inescapable theological prison. Those who died by their own hand faced consequences that would make even the bravest soul shudder. Their bodies were dragged through streets like criminals, impaled at crossroads with wooden stakes, and denied the sacred rite of Christian burial. Their families didn't just lose a loved one, they lost everything. Property was confiscated, reputations were destroyed, and the stigma of suicide would haunt their descendants for generations. This wasn't just religious theory, it was enforced with terrifying efficiency. Church records from the period reveal meticulous documentation of suicide cases, each one treated as a crime not just against society, but against God himself. The medieval mind saw suicide as the ultimate act of despair, a rejection of God's sovereignty over life and death that demanded the harshest possible response. Yet human nature, even when cornered by theological terror, finds ways to adapt. As mental illness, depression, and despair plagued medieval communities just as they do today, people began searching for alternatives. If suicide meant damnation and living meant unbearable suffering, there had to be another way out. The solution they found would shake our modern sensibilities to their core. In the dimly lit halls of medieval justice, a chilling pattern began to take shape. Between 1580 and 1839, coroners and church officials documented case after case of what appeared to be calculated child murders. But these weren't ordinary crimes of passion or madness. They were desperate acts of theological manipulation that would make even the most hardened modern investigator pause. Take the case of William de Wedmore, a vicar whose body was found hanging in his own home. His brothers, desperate to preserve both his dignity and their inheritance, buried him in secret without alerting the coroner. Their actions reveal the suffocating pressure that medieval society placed on families of suicide victims. But this was just the beginning of a much darker tale. The records tell us of approximately 400 documented cases across German-speaking territories, with Vienna alone recording 95 cases between 1668 and 1783. These weren't random acts of violence. They followed a precise, almost ritualistic pattern. The perpetrators would carefully select their victims, usually choosing young children, believed to be in a state of grace. After committing the murder, they would immediately surrender themselves to authorities, confess their crime, and demand execution. The medieval mind had constructed a perverse logic. While suicide meant eternal damnation, execution for a confessed crime offered a path to salvation. The murderer could receive last rites, make peace with God, and die properly, their soul theoretically saved through this macabre loophole in divine law. The Air records paint a particularly vivid picture of how this practice spread across social classes and religious boundaries. Both Protestants and Catholics participated, suggesting that the fear of damnation transcended even the deep religious divisions of the time. The murder rate from these cases alone would be shocking by modern standards. Yet medieval authorities found themselves in an impossible position. Their very system of deterrence had created an unintended path to salvation through murder. What makes these cases particularly haunting is their intersection with medieval understanding of mental illness. The courts distinguished between those who killed in a frenzy, considered accidents due to temporary madness, and those who calculated their actions. This distinction would prove crucial in the dark algebra of salvation that these desperate souls performed. The practice reveals a society caught in a theological trap of its own making. The harder the church pushed against suicide, the more it inadvertently created conditions for an even greater sin. Yet the perpetrators weren't typically hardened criminals or religious zealots. They were ordinary people, driven to extraordinary acts by a system that offered them no other escape from their despair. The medieval justice system wasn't just about maintaining order. It was a complex dance between earthly and divine law. What made this system particularly fascinating was how it created the perfect conditions for this dark practice to flourish. The courts, while officially condemning both murder and suicide, inadvertently provided a framework that made this macabre solution possible. Think about the medieval execution. It wasn't just a punishment, it was a public spectacle of redemption. The condemned would be paraded through streets, given time with priests, offered chances for confession and absolution. This elaborate ritual transformed execution from mere punishment into a pathway to salvation. For those trapped in suicidal despair, this religious theater offered something suicide could never provide: a good death in the eyes of the church. The legal system's handling of property rights created another crucial piece of this dark puzzle. While suicide victims' estates were confiscated, leaving their families destitute, the property of executed criminals often followed different rules. Some regions allowed condemned prisoners to make wills, ensuring their families wouldn't face the same material ruin that befell the families of suicide victims. But here's where it gets even more intriguing. The medieval courts began noticing patterns. Records from the period show increasing awareness of what we might call suicide by proxy. Yet, they found themselves in an impossible position. How could they deter someone who sought death as their punishment? The very foundation of their penal system, the threat of execution, became its greatest weakness. The church's role in this legal framework added another layer of complexity. Priests were required to offer spiritual comfort to the condemned, regardless of their crimes. This meant that someone who committed murder, specifically to be executed, would receive the same spiritual services as any other condemned criminal. The system, in its rigid adherence to procedure, couldn't distinguish between those who committed crimes out of malice and those who did so seeking their own death. This intersection of legal and religious authority created what modern psychologists might call a perverse incentive. The harsher the punishment for suicide, the more attractive this alternative became. The more elaborate the execution ritual, the more it served as a form of sanctified death. The system had created its own perfect trap. The psychology behind these acts reveals something deeply unsettling about human nature when pushed to extremes. Medieval society's understanding of mental illness created a perfect storm where despair met doctrine in the most tragic way possible. You might wonder, what kind of mental state drives someone to such calculated violence? The answer lies in the intersection of religious terror and what we'd now recognize as severe depression. Medieval medical texts describe conditions like melancholia and religious mania, terms that barely scratch the surface of the complex psychological states these individuals experienced. But here's the truly fascinating part. These weren't impulsive acts of madness. Each case followed a carefully reasoned, albeit twisted logic that made perfect sense within the medieval worldview. The social ripples of these acts spread far beyond the immediate tragedy. Communities found themselves grappling with an impossible moral equation. How do you respond when someone commits murder not from malice or greed, but from a desperate attempt to save their own soul? The medieval mind had to wrestle with questions that would challenge even modern ethical frameworks. Women's cases present a particularly revealing window into this phenomenon. Their stories often intertwined with accusations of witchcraft and demonic possession, adding layers of complexity to already complicated cases. Court records show how judges struggled to categorize these crimes. Were they acts of madness, religious devotion, or calculated manipulation of the system? The impact on families extended far beyond the immediate tragedy. Unlike regular murders, these cases created a unique form of collective trauma. Imagine living in a community where your neighbor's child was killed, not from hatred, but because someone saw them as a pure soul whose death could provide a twisted form of salvation. The psychological burden on these communities must have been staggering. But perhaps the most chilling aspect was how this practice revealed the unintended consequences of rigid religious doctrine colliding with human despair. The very systems designed to prevent suicide ended up creating something far more horrific. It's a stark reminder of how attempts to control human behavior through fear of eternal punishment can backfire in the most devastating ways.